Hello, my name is Neil Davidson and I'm the founder of Umber Studios. Welcome to another online drawing session. This session mimics the structure of a regular life drawing class. We'll show you one or more photographs on the screen and it's your job to draw what you see. We'll have an artist joining us, doing a demonstration and giving hints and tips. You can either follow their advice or do your own thing. It is entirely up to you. Once the session is finished, don't forget to post your work onto Instagram and hashtag it with #RawUmberLive. You can also download the reference photographs and watch this video again after the session is finished. So if the artist is going too fast for you, don't worry. You can watch the video now and then watch it again later on. Right, let's get started.
Hello everyone and welcome to this latest Raw Umber portrait video. In this video I will be drawing a single 1 hour pose and I'll be using some willow charcoal to do the majority of the drawing. For the details I like to use a compressed charcoal pencil. In this case this one is done by Generals and is in 6B, so very soft. To blend I personally like to use brushes, but you can also use a stump or your finger or anything that you like to use to blend. And finally I like to use a putty rubber to erase. A grey putty rubber is best, but you can also just use a normal rubber. Now you can find all these materials below the video in the materials link. So let's get started, and the first thing I always look for is the square of the head. And we're looking at her photograph. I can see that block, that square of the head, going from the nose to the back of the head and the chin and the top of the skull. And the way I measure this is by using comparative measurements. So I'm just checking the front versus the back and comparing this on the photograph as well as on my drawing. Now I can do the same thing for the neck and the shoulders as well. Now in this video I want to talk about actually not drawing a lot of stuff, because often we feel like the more we draw the better the drawing, but it's actually often the more we lose the better the drawing. So first I'm just going to block in the main masses of the portrait, and for this I'm using an old bit of charcoal, just sand it a little bit to open up the grain, and I'm just covering everything I've just drawn lightly. I can then use a bit of old kitchen roll to just gently blend this into the paper to get rid of any grain or small marks. Now we can see that the hair is a bit darker than the skin. And I'm just first going to simplify everything into 2 tones or values, dark tones and light tones. Now the hair is a really big block of dark tones, so I'm using that little bit of charcoal that has the grain opened on the sides, and I'm just covering that whole hair area with the side of my charcoal. So now with this biggest block put in, we can have a look at the top of the hairline. And if we have a look at that, we can see that the top of the forehead is more or less straight. And this is a very useful indication, because this is the direction of the eyebrows as well as the chin. And in fact, when we look at the other measurements, they also mirror that same direction. So for instance, I often like to find the midline of the pose, which is usually the corners of the eyes. And I'm just using some comparative measurement here to make sure it's in the middle. And if we divide the whole of the skull into 3 equal thirds, we will have bottom of the chin to bottom of the nose to base of the brow, and finally base of the brow to the top of the forehead. So these are the 3 thirds of the face, and I will use these on pretty much each portrait. Now of course, this is very personal to each different individual face, so I use these as beginning tools and then I start personalizing later on. Now I'm continuing to look at these big shapes using the side of my charcoal. And the first big shape I see is a triangle shape underneath the nose. Now I'm not looking at the nostrils here or the bigger or smaller little indentations. I'm just looking at this big triangle and putting it in. I can also see from the side of that nostril a big shadow going down along the side of the mouth to the bottom of the jaw. Now this way of working will feel very messy at the start, and feel free to just blend things together like I'm doing now in order to make it a little bit less messy. But we will start adding more specific shapes later on. So next I'm just filling in the dark shape of the eye sockets, and again this is very rough at the start. Now what I'm trying to do here is keep things vague, but at the same time try to look at shapes. For instance, what is the shape of the light on the forehead? We can see it's a sort of rectangle that's a bit more narrow at the top. So I'm just trying to copy that without thinking about the portrait as such, just copying these shapes. Now while I'm adjusting some of my shapes, feel free to ask me anything you like in the comments if you're watching this live. And of course, if you find that everything is getting a bit messy, just blend the darks together. Now next what I want to do is start adding some clear and confident lines where I see them. So because the drawing is so vague, it now makes it really easy for us to see where the drawing needs some sharpness and focus. And I try to add one line per element. And what I mean by this is, for instance, around the nose, I can see a really nice sharp line. And the division between the dark and the light at the bridge of the nose. And I can see another sharp area at the bottom of the shadow of the nose. And if you're making a mistake, feel free to just blend things together. Doesn't matter if it's a bit messy, and retry. And let's find a line for each element. So also, for instance, one on the forehead. Where do you see the line being the sharpest there? Now sometimes when you start adding in these sharp details, you can suddenly see where you need to adjust the shapes. And this is because you've gained a fresh eye. What this means is that because we've added more information, our brain suddenly perceives the drawing differently, and so we can see where things have gone a bit off. So whenever you notice something wrong in a drawing, just feel free to correct that. For instance, for me, I've just noticed that the mouth needs to be put in and a little bit higher as well. Now as I'm correcting this, I'm again using the side of the charcoal to keep everything nice and soft and a bit vague. I'm just looking for the little dark and light shapes. So for instance, a dark shape for the whole of the mouth and a light shape for the chin. Now coming back to the harder lines, I can start seeing some harder lines where the glasses are. So the sides of the glasses are two sharp vertical lines. Now keep in mind these should be in the same line as the brow, the forehead, the eye line and so on, because they're in the same perspective as the rest of the face. And once you've found more or less where they need to go, just go ahead and draw a nice sharp line. Another place where you may sometimes see sharp lines is at overlaps. So for instance, where the chin overlaps the background, I can see a very clear line. So again, it's a bit of a back and forth between that softness, that vagueness that we're drawing, and these sharper lines. And it's a good guide to find one per part of the drawing. So I'm finding one around the hair here now. And this ensures that there's a nice variety in the drawing. It's not all sharps or all softs. And I find generally that making something vague is much more productive, because if we have everything sharp at the start, which may be what feels more natural and more controlled, that means we have to soften almost everything. Whereas if we start really vague and soft, we only have to sharpen up a few areas of the drawing in order to bring focus. Now this style of drawing will look really messy at the start, so don't worry if you don't really see where this is going just yet. And we will have a bit of a back and forth as well. So in order to keep things nice and soft, I'm gonna now start blending things together. For instance, looking at the cheekbone going down towards the cheek, we can see there's a real gradation of tone there. And I'm going to use my blending tool, in my case a hog brush, so a very stiff-haired brush, but you can also use a stump or your finger to create this big gradation. Now again, this may feel like you're losing the drawing a bit. And the reason why I do this back and forth is that it's much easier for us to see sharp edges than it is for us to see soft edges. So if I emphasize the softs, it'll make it much easier for me to see where the hard edges should be, so the more prominent lines. So now I've blended everything together. I'm going in again with the flat of my widow charcoal. I'm just adding these dark shapes on top again. And this way I'm slowly building up the tones and refining the shapes, going from big shapes to smaller shapes. And like I said, it's a bit of a back and forth, so once I'm again happy with the progress I've made on the shapes, I'm gonna go in once again and blend them all together to create this big gradation. Now note that, for instance, in the chin, I'm not adding a line to indicate the bottom of the chin versus the neck. And this is called a lost edge. Basically, a lost edge is an area where we lose the contrast or emphasize the lack of contrast in order to bring focus to other parts of the drawing. And in this video, I really want to focus on not drawing some elements rather than drawing the others. Now this is very counterintuitive, so don't worry if you have trouble with this at first, but I promise it will all come together in the end. Alright, so hopefully you'll be able to start seeing a rough mass start to form that vaguely resembles a portrait. Now we can go back in and add in harsher lines with the charcoal. In this case, I'm going to use my rubber to carve out some of these harder edges or these overlaps. For instance, I can go around the outline and just cleaning up that edge, making it really nice and sharp using my rubber. Now, of course, if you need to soften something a bit more, feel free to blend these areas in. For instance, with a blending tool or even with your finger like I'm doing now. Now, if you do end up using your finger, make sure it's clean. Maybe wipe it on a bit of kitchen roll first. Sometimes the grease on our fingers can stick to the paper and create fingerprinty marks, which doesn't look as good. Or you could use a makeup brush as well, which is really good for blending. So feel free to experiment with different blending tools and see what you like to use. We're gonna go and once again add in these sharper edges and hopefully getting closer and closer to the drawing as we do so. And the goal here is to get more and more specific with each go. And you may feel like your work is being undone every time you blend. But nothing is further from the truth. It actually builds up these tones and these soft edges. And it's also very similar to how painting works. Because in painting, you first start covering the canvas with some paint and then you start pushing the paint around, blending a bit here and adding a bit more there. It's not a very linear process. Now with the addition of some of these hard edges, I feel like the face is starting to appear a little bit, but I haven't really worked that much on the hair yet. So I'm just going to go ahead and add some sharp edges to the neck and shoulder area and start adding some shapes to the hair. Now the only difference between the hair and the skin is that the hair can be a lot rougher because it's softer and it's not quite as precise as the skin, as well as the portrait. It doesn't really matter if a strand of hair is a bit lower or a bit wider, for instance. So I'm just going to add some more charcoal in the darker areas of the hair using the side of an old piece of widow charcoal. Now I could sharpen up the hair, but I find that adds too much focus to that area. So even though there's lots of stuff going on, I try to keep the focus on the face mainly and let the hair be a bit rougher. Now I've ignored the eye sockets a little bit, and this is because the eye sockets are actually very attractive to work on. A lot of the personality can be found in the eyes, and so I tend to counteract that natural attraction of the eyes and drawing the eyes with first doing all of the softs and the less interesting features, and doing the eyes once I'm warmed up in the drawing process. And also that will help me not focus too much on just the eyes. Now just like in the rest of the drawing, I'm just alternating finding the shapes of the eye socket with then finding some sharper edges in these eye sockets. And you can use the glasses for this. I can see some really nice sharp dark lines where the glasses are. Now if you make a mistake, don't worry, you can always erase it or blend it back in and then try again. And note that I'm not just following the glasses around with my charcoal. I'm trying to keep things very lost in this exercise. So I'm only drawing the parts that I really see very clearly, and I'm letting the rest be more or less lost in the rest of the drawing. Now, like I said, the hair should be of secondary focus. So the viewer should focus on the face first and then the hair. Now, if you feel like there's enough focus on the hair, feel free to add a few lines in the hair where you feel like it needs it, but try not to bring too much focus to that area. Alright, so a portrait is slowly starting to form. And at this point it may be a good idea to start bringing out the rubber and carve out some nice shapes using that. So we've been focusing mostly on using the charcoal to create these harsher edges, but now I'm going to start looking at bringing out some clearer edges using the rubber. Now, because of all the blending we've been doing, there should be enough charcoal even on the whites to be able to pull out these lights. If that's not the case, feel free to continue blending a little bit more, or just continue working on your charcoal areas. Now sometimes it may look a bit harsh at first, so it's a good idea to blend in these lighter shapes as well if they feel a little bit too harsh compared to the softness surrounding these areas. Now again, this video is about lost edges, so not drawing everything in and seeing how far we can push the drawing by keeping everything quite vague. And so even with the glasses, I try to only add a little bit of light where I can really see it shine, and just add the absolute minimum on both ends. And what's so interesting about this for me is that our brains immediately fill in the rest of the shapes around the glasses, even though I've only added a few accents. And this is the power of lost edges. And at first they feel very counterintuitive. And once you get into them, they're just such a powerful way to create a portrait where you're just suggesting shapes rather than drawing them all out. Now, even at this stage, you may notice that you've made a mistake or you suddenly see something that needs to be changed. And luckily, this way of working is very, very flexible. For instance, in my case, I've noticed that the nose feels a bit too big and I forgot to put in a little shadow at the bridge of the nose. So just taking the same techniques we used before, just adding these shapes in now. And note that I'm not erasing everything and starting again. Instead, I am doing something that I like to call pushing the shapes around. I'm taking a shape I already have, move it a bit to the left in this instance, and then once I'm happy with the new positioning, then I start blending it in. Now, if you ever find that while adjusting the shapes, the charcoal takes off more than it puts on, like it does for instance right now in the eye. This often means that the charcoal's grain hasn't been opened, so I always just use a bit of sandpaper, use the side of the charcoal, open up the grain, and it should then start putting down the charcoal nicely again. Now, as you can see, I haven't actually drawn in the eyes at all. We just have a very vague shape with a bit of a hint at the lashes and a bit of a hint at the highlights and the glasses there. But still, our brains can completely interpret this as a face. And this is really what makes Lost Edges, to me at least, so interesting and make for such an interesting drawing. Because instead of having everything drawn out, we let the viewer do the work and interpret the drawing. Now I'm just going to continue losing some edges and adjusting some of my shapes for a few moments. And if you have any questions at all, feel free to let me know here in the comments if you're watching this live. Now, like I was saying earlier, the hair isn't actually the main focus of the drawing, and so I'm losing all of the hair into the shadow of the neck as well as the bottom of the chin, so really losing those edges. But it may be fun to just add a bit of an accent there to create some little bit of focus, and so I'm just working now on the earring, and again trying to keep things minimal, losing as many edges as I can get away with, but just using the rubber to indicate some of the shimmery areas of the earring. Now, just like everything else, I like to work back and forth, so adding it in, maybe blending it back, reinstating some of these shapes and going back and forth until I feel happy with the focus as well as the shape. And these small accents in the middle of an otherwise completely lost shape can be really powerful. For instance, I can do the same thing on the eyelid, just hinting at the light on our eyelid. And of course, like I did on the other parts as well, blending this in and reinstating if needed. Now, a little note about the reflection in glasses. If the light's coming from the top right, like it is in this particular drawing, the reflection will sit in a diagonal that the light falls down. And what this means is that The light will hit first at the top right of the glasses, where the glasses are closest to the light, and then we'll see the reflection of that on the other side, so the bottom left of the glasses. So I can follow that reflection at the bottom left with my rubber as well. This indicates that shininess of the glass, the transparency of the glass. And again, we're just hinting at things here, leaving a lot of the edges completely lost, to see what's the minimum we can get away with in order to make these feel like glasses. And I can do the same thing with the hair and the neck. So I might add a few sort of strands of hair using my rubber, just indicating some texture there. And trying to balance out that focus on the face versus the hair, but also having a bit of interest in that area. And this is really where you as the artist can start making decisions. Where do you want the focus to be? That's the area where you want to add the most shapes and the most detail. And which are the areas that you don't want the viewer to focus on? And see if you can find some more lost edges in that area. For instance, for me, the focus should really be on the glasses, and so I'm losing that chin into the neck even more. Really making it into a completely lost edge. Now, as the drawing is getting more precise, you might find it difficult to control the willow charcoal. And this is where charcoal pencils can come in. You could even use a normal black pencil if you don't have a charcoal pencil on you. And the main thing I like to do is just gently glaze over the shapes that I've made. And what I mean by this is that I use very little pressure. I'm not adding lines. Instead, I'm just very gently going over my shapes, adding very little tone where I need it, maybe a bit more harshness where I need it, but overall just sort of cleaning things up. Now the nice thing about the pencil, of course, is that it's much more precise. So really nice for this final part of the drawing where we're really getting into the finish and the final result, and we're not moving things around as much anymore. And so we can find areas in the darks that maybe feel a bit patchy and just fill these pieces in with the charcoal or the normal pencil. Also because it is a sharp pencil, and I like to keep it also quite sharp. It's really good for making sure that my sharps really feel nice and crisp, for instance on the outline here. Do keep in mind though that willow is very easy to erase and very flexible for that reason, whereas pencil as well as charcoal pencil have a lot of fillers added and therefore are harder to erase. So I only use this to make small adjustments of areas that I'm pretty sure won't move around that much anymore. But it's perfect for adding small changes to my shapes, for instance here, adjusting that shadow on the nose to indicate a bit of the nostril there, with a slight change of direction. And this sort of precision is kind of hard to get with just willow charcoal. There's also areas in the darks that feel a bit patchy, and I want to emphasize that lost edge that I've been speaking about. So this is where I come in with very little pressure, just using a glazing method to just go over these areas that need a bit of darkening to bring that lost edge out even more. And this really ties the shadows together and brings more focus to the picture. And sometimes we can feel that adding more detail to the drawing will bring more focus, but it's actually contrast that brings the focus to a picture. So the darker we can make our darks and the lighter we can make our lights, the more punch the drawing will have. This is why I spend a bit of time just precisely and slowly darkening some of these lost edges in the shadows, instead of adding more detail. Something else that's really useful at this finishing stage is surrounding your highlights with a bit of a darker line, and this just makes them a bit sharper and therefore they jump out a bit more as a harsh highlight. So I've been darkening the face and making it more precise, and this gives me more scope to do stuff with the hair because this now feels a little bit rough in comparison. Now luckily with the hair I want it to be a bit rough, so I can just start darkening it with my willow charcoal. Now when adding detail to the hair, it can be quite tempting to get stuck in. So we look at one area, see what's going on there and start adding a little bit of this and a little bit of that and a few hairs here and maybe this sharp edge there, and maybe there's a bit more information we can add to the earring, and before you know it, the focus has shifted away from the face and towards the hair. So what I tend to do to counteract this is step back away from my drawing, if that's possible of course. Otherwise you can also squint or use a mirror to see it in a new view. And often I find just getting rid of the information actually makes the drawing more powerful, like I'm doing now on the hair. So again, the temptation can be there to add a lot of detail and small hair in areas where you do see it, of course. But as artists, we need to curate the drawing instead of just copying everything that we see. So instead of adding all this detail, what I'm gonna do is make this area even more lost, and I'm gonna try and darken it even more in order to bring that focus towards the area that I've decided is most important. And again, the more contrast you can give a drawing, the more focus it will have. So really try to darken those darks. Now, because we've lost so much, now we have much more scope to add details in the areas where we haven't lost everything. So this means that we can up the amount of detail in the highlights, for instance. And that's what I'm going to do next, using my finger as well as my rubber to indicate a few hairs there. But again, always referring back to the bigger picture and trying to make sure that the focus is still on the face and on the glasses, as I've decided that's the most important part of the picture for me. And of course, you can decide to make another part of the picture your focus, and that's up to you as the artist. Alright, so we're almost at the end of the pose, so I'm just going to continue drawing on this for a little bit. If you have any questions at all, feel free to let me know here in the comments if you're watching this live, and otherwise I will speak to you at the end of the pose. Alright, so that's the end of the pose. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you've enjoyed losing these edges. Now, if you're not a subscriber yet and you enjoyed this video, we do a portrait video every Sunday as well as a figure video every Wednesday evening. So consider subscribing if you enjoyed this video. Finally, if you'd like to show us your work, try to use the photograph button right here in the chat, or alternatively, if you use Instagram, use the hashtag #RawUmberLive.
I hope you enjoyed the session and thank you for taking part. Don't forget to post your works onto Instagram and hashtag them with #RawUmberLive. We run 2 sessions a week, a figure drawing session every Wednesday at 8 PM and portrait drawing every Sunday at 4 PM. The last portrait session of every month is free. Thank you and goodbye.